The year was 1853, in the coal valleys of Pennsylvania, where a man's reputation could condemn his family long after he was gone. This is the story of a boy who was forced to pay for his father's crime. He was never accused in court, never judged by law. Yet an entire town decided he must suffer for something he did not do. Before anyone questioned the truth, punishment had already begun, and the boy learned how quickly justice could disappear when fear ruled people's hearts. Ashford Hollow was a small mining town, surrounded by dark hills that trapped smoke and coal dust in the air. The streets were narrow, the houses worn, and the people deeply loyal to tradition. In a place like this, trust mattered more than evidence, and once a family name turned sour, it rarely recovered. 14-year-old Nathaniel Carter lived at the far edge of town in a modest wooden house that leaned slightly toward the road as though tired from years of harsh winters. Nathaniel was known as a respectful and hard-working boy, quiet enough that most adults approved of him instantly. He helped neighbors without being asked and spoke politely even when others ignored him. But during that winter, people stopped seeing Nathaniel as a boy. They saw only his surname, Carter, and the rumors attached to it. 3 nights earlier, his father, Jonathan Carter, had disappeared after being accused of murdering the town treasurer, Wallace Pembroke. The treasurer had been found dead behind his desk just before sunrise. The office safe standing open and emptied of funds meant to pay the miners. Jonathan Carter had been the last person seen entering the building that evening. No witnesses came forward afterward, and by morning, the town had already created its own version of events. By noon, whispers claimed Jonathan had stolen the money. By evening, those whispers hardened into certainty that he had killed Pembroke and fled to escape punishment. Nathaniel first felt the change when he entered Miller's general store to buy bread. Conversations slowed as soon as he stepped. Inside, Mrs. Miller avoided his gaze while wrapping the loaf, her movements stiff and uncomfortable. She asked him to place payment on the counter before handing over the bread, something she had never done before. Nathaniel obeyed quietly, pretending not to notice the difference, though the silence around him felt heavier than any spoken accusation. When he left the store, he realized people were watching him as though guilt could be inherited. School became worse. Children repeated the harsh words they heard from their parents at home. One boy whispered loudly enough for others to hear that Nathaniel's father was a thief. Another claimed murder ran in families. A shove near the water pump sent Nathaniel stumbling, followed by laughter that echoed across the yard. He chose not to fight back. Part of him feared anger would only confirm what people already believed. Yet another part of him struggled with doubt, remembering how restless his father had seemed in recent weeks, pacing late at night, speaking less during meals, and staring out windows as though expecting trouble to arrive. On the final evening before his disappearance, Jonathan Carter had spoken unusually seriously. Resting a firm hand on Nathaniel's shoulder, he had said, "No matter what happens, you stay honest, even if the whole town forgets how." At the time, Nathaniel thought it was simple advice from a worried parent. Now the words felt like preparation for something terrible. 2 days after the accusation spread, Sheriff Augustus Hale arrived at the Carter house. His knock struck the door with authority rather than courtesy. When Nathaniel opened it, the sheriff stood with 2 deputies behind him, their expressions already convinced of guilt. Hale asked where Jonathan Carter had gone. Nathaniel answered truthfully that he did not know. The sheriff stepped inside anyway, examining the small home with cold curiosity before announcing that the town considered Jonathan responsible for the missing money and the treasurer's death. Until repayment was made, he explained, the Carter property would fall under town control. Nathaniel struggled to understand. He insisted he had done nothing wrong. But the sheriff responded calmly that debts followed family names. Since Jonathan Carter was gone, responsibility now belonged to his son. The words settled heavily in the room, turning Nathaniel's confusion into fear. By afternoon, a wooden notice was nailed onto the front door declaring, "The property under investigation." Neighbors gathered openly to watch, whispering among themselves as though witnessing public justice rather than private suffering. Some suggested the boy should be sent to work in the mines to repay the stolen money. Others argued he should be removed from Ashford Hollow entirely before he caused further trouble. No one asked Nathaniel what he knew or whether his father might be innocent. Judgment required no proof when fear had already chosen its target. That night, unable to sleep beneath the weight of humiliation and uncertainty, Nathaniel searched his father's room for answers. The house felt emptier than ever, each sound echoing sharply through the silence. Inside a drawer beneath folded clothing, he discovered a small leather notebook. Most pages were blank, but near the back a single sentence appeared repeatedly, written with hurried pressure, as though his father feared forgetting it. "Pembroke knew the truth?" Nathaniel read the words again and again, his heartbeat quickening. If Wallace Pembroke knew the truth, then his death meant more than robbery. It meant secrets, dangerous ones. And if his father had not been the villain the town believed, then someone else in Ashford Hollow had reason to silence both men. Outside wind moved through the valley like a distant warning, and for the first time, Nathaniel understood something far more frightening than accusation. The town was not searching for justice. It was hiding from the truth, and somehow he had become the price that truth demanded. The morning after Sheriff Hale's visit, Nathaniel woke to a strange quiet in the town. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and the usual hum of miners preparing for work was replaced with low whispers and sideways glances. He dressed quickly, his hands shaking slightly, and went to the kitchen where the empty stove mocked him. There was no breakfast. His mother, Clara Carter, had gone to the neighbors to plead for food, but most refused. The town had decided that the son of a supposed criminal deserved no comfort. By mid-morning, the sheriff returned, this time with 2 deputies and a list of duties Nathaniel was expected to complete to repay his father's alleged debt. The work was cruel and unrelenting, hauling coal from abandoned shafts, repairing fences in freezing weather, and running errands for townspeople, who glared at him as if his very presence was a punishment. The boy's shoulders ached, and his hands were raw from the ropes and shovels. Yet no one offered sympathy. If he faltered even slightly, a warning look from Sheriff Hale or a shove from the deputies reminded him that failure would mean worse treatment. While laboring, Nathaniel began to notice how the townspeople watched him not merely for mistakes but for signs of weakness. Children whispered insults, neighbors muttered curses under their breath, and tradesmen refused to sell him supplies unless paid in advance. It was as though the entire town had conspired to make him understand one harsh truth. Guilt once assigned does not need proof. It only needs a victim. Even at home there was no refuge. Clara, though loving and determined, could do little. She brought soup and bread when possible, but Nathaniel watched her hands tremble as she served him. At night, he often found himself staring at his father's empty chair, wishing for Jonathan's guidance, wishing for someone to reveal the truth before it was too late. Instead, he had only the leather notebook, its repeated line echoing in his mind, "Pembroke knew the truth." One afternoon, Nathaniel was sent to deliver a message to Mr. Silas Greer, the town merchant. Greer had once spoken kindly to him, but now he glared like a man who wanted to punish history itself. "Your father's debts must be settled," Greer said sharply, handing Nathaniel a sack of flour heavier than his own frame. The boy lifted it, forcing a strained smile, and made his way back through the snow-covered streets, feeling every whisper and stare as if it weighed more than the bag on his shoulders. That evening, while tending the small yard behind their house, Nathaniel overheard a conversation that chilled him more than the winter wind. 2 men spoke of Wallace Pembroke's death not as an accident but as part of a plan. "The boy's father never meant to harm Pembroke," one said. But someone had to make sure. The truth stayed buried. The Siwas in Toysum, other laughed quietly. And now we've got the son. Punishment runs through blood, after all. Nathaniel froze, understanding that the cruelty surrounding him was not merely vengeance or fear. It was intentional, calculated and far-reaching. Days turned into weeks, and Nathaniel's body and spirit were tested beyond what a child should endure. Every sunrise brought new labor, every sunset new whispers. Letters from distant relatives arrived occasionally, but the contents were neutral, almost avoiding the topic entirely, as if they feared involvement might worsen his situation. Isolation became a constant companion, with Nathaniel's only solace the quiet moments reading his father's journal. Each entry, though short, hinted at secrets buried deeper than the town could imagine. Despite the hardship, Nathaniel began to notice subtle acts of kindness. A loaf of bread left near the door by an anonymous neighbor, a warm blanket folded over a fence he repaired. These small gestures reminded him that not all hearts in Ashford Hollow were hardened by suspicion, yet each kindness was fleeting, overshadowed by the relentless judgment from the majority. It made him wonder if mercy could ever truly survive in a place so obsessed with appearances and inherited guilt. News of Nathaniel's labor and suffering had spread to neighboring towns. Some commiserated quietly, while others relished the story as a cautionary tale. It was then that he realized the story of his father's crime, real or imagined, had grown beyond Ashford Hollow. In every glance, whisper, and laborious task, the boy was reminded, the town would not stop until it had extracted payment in full, regardless of the truth. And in the shadows, Nathaniel understood that someone was watching him even closer than Sheriff Hale, someone with motives darker than mere justice. The relentless work, the cruel eyes, and the icy streets became a constant reminder. Nathaniel was not being punished for what he had done, but for what his father was accused of doing. And yet, deep inside, he clung to one hope, that the truth about Wallace Pembroke's death would emerge before the town's cruelty destroyed him entirely. Nathaniel moved silently through the snow-dusted streets of Ashford Hollow, each step a reminder that the town's judgment had become a constant burden. Every face he passed carried suspicion, and every whisper seemed directed at him alone. The labor imposed by Sheriff Hale was relentless, and the tasks assigned were both exhausting and demeaning. He hauled coal that felt heavier than his own body, repaired broken fences with hands raw and bleeding, and delivered messages to people whose expressions made it clear they held nothing but contempt for him. Each interaction reminded him that in this town, a surname carried guilt that no innocence could erase. At the Carter house, Clara worked tirelessly to preserve what little warmth remained. She moved quietly, tending to the household with care, offering Nathaniel small gestures of comfort whenever she could. Her eyes, however, were clouded with worry, reflecting the fear that had settled over the family since Jonathan's disappearance. Nathaniel often watched her hands tremble as she handled food or mended clothes, and the sight reinforced the cruel reality of their situation. No matter what they did, the town would not relent in its punishment. It seemed as though every action, no matter how small or honest, would be twisted into confirmation of guilt. Nathaniel spent long hours in his father's study, examining the leather-bound notebook that had become his only connection to Jonathan. The repeated line, "Pembroke knew the truth," seemed to pulse with meaning he could not yet grasp. He turned each page carefully, trying to decode his father's intentions, trying to understand why Wallace Pembroke's death had brought such relentless scrutiny upon his family. The journal offered fragments, hints of danger and secrets, but no answers complete enough to offer comfort. It was as though his father had left him a puzzle with pieces missing, and the town had become the force pushing him toward an outcome he could not yet predict. Nathaniel's work outside was scrutinized with unrelenting eyes. Neighbors and townspeople watched his movements, measuring every lift of a sack, every stroke of a hammer, and every breath he took. Their whispers carried through the air like icy currents, each word designed to remind him of his family's supposed failings. Some acts of cruelty were deliberate, a shove here, a sharp remark there, while others were subtler, disguised as concern or advice. Nathaniel began to notice patterns in the behavior around him, learning which faces harbored resentment, which offered fleeting kindness, and which could be cautiously trusted. Observation became a necessary skill, and even small gestures of empathy became treasures in a town that had made suspicion the default. One day, while delivering a parcel to a merchant who had once spoken kindly to him, Nathaniel felt the weight of eyes on his back and heard the quiet mutterings that followed him. The merchant did not meet his gaze, handing him the package with mechanical motions. Nathaniel forced a polite nod, a faint smile that concealed both exhaustion and growing resolve. Even in the presence of strangers who saw only the Carter name, he began to understand that endurance alone would not preserve him. He would need cunning, patience, and a careful awareness of the truths that others sought to hide. A rare moment of reprieve came in unexpected gestures. An anonymous neighbor left a loaf of bread at the doorstep. Another draped a blanket over the fence where he worked, providing some relief against the biting cold. Even brief acknowledgments from a sympathetic passerby offered hope, fragile as it was. Nathaniel clung to these small kindnesses, allowing them to remind him that not every heart in Ashford Hollow was hardened by fear or judgment. He began to sense that amidst the cruelty, there existed a network of quiet support, though it was scattered and tentative. He discovered another small ally in Elias Monroe, a boy slightly older, who seemed to recognize the injustice Nathaniel faced. Elias's words were cautious, spoken so that only Nathaniel could hear them, yet they carried profound significance. "I think what they're doing is wrong," Elias said once, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one else heard. Nathaniel felt a flicker of relief and companionship, understanding that even amidst a town set against him, subtle solidarity could exist. But the warning in Elias's tone reminded him that any misstep in revealing defiance could bring harsher consequences. The whispers and observations were accompanied by physical exhaustion that tested Nathaniel in ways he had never experienced. Each movement, whether carrying heavy sacks, repairing fences, or delivering messages, was under scrutiny. He realized the town's cruelty was not only in punishment, but in psychological endurance, a constant reminder that innocence alone would not shield him. Every act of compliance, every polite nod, was both a survival tactic and a silent protest against the injustice he endured. Through it all, Nathaniel returned frequently to his father's notes, piecing together fragmented hints that suggested Wallace Pembroke's death had hidden layers unknown to anyone in Ashford Hollow. He understood that someone had orchestrated events with precision, that his father had been caught in a trap, and that now the boy himself was being tested as a consequence. Observation and deduction became vital, as the town's cruelty was accompanied by secrecy and unseen threats. Nathaniel began to see patterns, to understand which individuals in the town held sway, and which were vulnerable to influence. He realized survival required more than labor. It required intelligence, discretion, and careful patience. In the quiet moments alone, Nathaniel allowed himself reflection and resolve. The harsh punishment had begun to forge a different strength within him, a combination of resilience and clarity that the townspeople could not see. He understood that endurance alone would not suffice. He must also cultivate awareness, reading subtle cues and measuring intentions in every interaction. The leather-bound journal, the hidden acts of kindness, and the cautious alliance with Elias Monroe became pillars in the fragile architecture of his plan. Each observation, no matter how small, contributed to a broader understanding of the forces arrayed against him. As Nathaniel worked through these trials, he began to speak aloud in moments of privacy, reinforcing his determination and resolve. "Father, I will not let them destroy what you tried to protect. I will find the truth," he whispered, his voice firm despite weariness. The act was a silent rebellion, a personal vow that strengthened him against the constant barrage of judgment and labor. It reminded him that though the town sought to punish and isolate him, he retained control over his own choices, his own courage, and his own pursuit of justice. The boy's endurance, observations, and cautious strategies marked the beginning of a subtle transformation. Ashford Hollow had sought to break him through physical labor, public scrutiny, and psychological pressure, but Nathaniel discovered in himself a growing resourcefulness and resilience. Each cruel glance and whispered insult served only to sharpen his awareness and reinforce the need for patience, careful planning, and attention to detail. He began to anticipate potential threats, to measure words and actions, and to identify those few individuals who might aid him if he could gain their trust. In the midst of this struggle, Nathaniel's story had begun to capture attention beyond the town itself. Travelers passing through whispered of the boy laboring under the weight of his father's alleged crime, and in those whispers he detected curiosity mixed with unease. The wider world seemed unaware of the full truth, and that realization reinforced the stakes. Nathaniel knew that surviving Ashford Hollow was only the first step. Uncovering the truth behind Wallace Pembroke's death and his father's involvement, or lack thereof, was the greater challenge. For viewers following this story, Nathaniel's perseverance and the mysteries that envelop his family are central to the unfolding events. If you find yourself drawn into his struggle and the dark secrets of Ashford Hollow, like this video and subscribe to the channel to follow each chapter as the truth slowly emerges. The journey is long, the danger real, and every detail could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Nathaniel Carter had endured relentless punishment, social isolation, and physical exhaustion. Yet amidst the town's cruelty, he discovered the beginnings of resilience, small signs of compassion, and the first threads of a plan to uncover the truth. The weight of inherited guilt pressed heavily upon him, but within that pressure, a spark of determination grew. He understood that survival depended not only on strength and endurance, but on wit, observation, and courage. The boy who had been forced to pay for his father's crime was learning, slowly and deliberately, to navigate the treacherous world that sought to destroy him, preparing for the challenges that lay ahead. The weight of Ashford Hollow's scrutiny pressed on Nathaniel Carter like a constant shadow. Every task imposed by the town was heavier, not merely in physical labor but in humiliation. Neighbors who once ignored him now whispered loudly, their voices carrying far enough for him to hear at the far edge of the property. Shops refused to serve him, offering icy glances instead of food, and townspeople stared with the certainty of people convinced that innocence was irrelevant. Nathaniel had long accepted that no act of hard work or politeness would earn reprieve. He had learned instead to move carefully, measured in every gesture, while observing the town's patterns with growing attentiveness. Every glance, every sigh, every quiet remark became a potential clue to understanding the forces aligned against him. Even as he toiled, Nathaniel felt a subtle, almost imperceptible escalation in the town's tactics. Men who had once only whispered now confronted him directly, demanding explanations for his father's disappearance and accusing him of deception. Their words were sharp, their eyes hard, and though they could not prove guilt, their certainty alone inflicted a heavier punishment than any labor or punishment imposed by Sheriff Hale. Nathaniel felt the town's cruelty as a tangible pressure, weighing him down as though the very air conspired against him. He learned to respond with quiet defiance, measured politeness and careful observation, knowing that any overt sign of fear or anger could be turned against him. The work itself had become more demanding. Tasks that required strength, patience, or skill were chosen not for necessity, but for their ability to exhaust him, to expose him to ridicule, and to remind the boy that the Carter name was still considered tainted. Hauling wood, repairing fences, and clearing snow from the narrow streets was no longer sufficient. Now he was sent on errands where merchants deliberately overloaded him with supplies or demanded he navigate treacherous paths with fragile goods. Nathaniel adjusted quickly, learning to carry heavier burdens and anticipate the subtle ways people sought to challenge him. Each small success reinforced a growing understanding that endurance alone would not suffice. He needed strategy, cunning, and vigilance. Amid the relentless labor and observation, Nathaniel continued to consult his father's journal. The repeated line, "Pembroke knew the truth," remained a puzzle, its meaning growing ever more pressing. Through the fragments and hints left behind, Nathaniel began to suspect that Wallace Pembroke's death had deeper consequences than anyone in the town realized. Someone had deliberately framed his father, and the boy himself was now caught in a web of fear, control, and secrecy. Every subtle act of the townspeople, the narrowed eyes, the whispered comments, the careful avoidance of certain houses, suggested that hidden motives were at play, and that Ashford Hollow was far more dangerous than it appeared on the surface. In the quiet moments Nathaniel found between tasks, he began to piece together patterns. Certain men, previously unnoticed, moved in ways that suggested coordination, while others acted with predictable malice. The town's cruelty was not random. It was organized, deliberate, and tailored to ensure that he would remain isolated, exhausted, and unable to uncover the truth. Even small kindnesses were rare and fleeting, often accompanied by watchful eyes, a reminder that the cost of trust was perilously high. Nathaniel began to realize that surviving this environment would require not only physical endurance but also intelligence, discretion, and an awareness of the subtle forces shaping every interaction. A cautious alliance with Elias Monroe provided the first glimmers of hope. Elias offered advice, guidance, and small support, teaching Nathaniel how to navigate conversations with townspeople without provoking further cruelty. Through whispered warnings, subtle gestures, and careful observation, Nathaniel began to develop a sense of agency in a town that sought to strip him of all control. He learned to anticipate challenges, to read hidden intentions, and to measure his responses with precision. The partnership, though tentative, became a lifeline, a reminder that even amidst relentless cruelty, there could be connection and strategy. The mental strain was almost as punishing as the physical labor. Nathaniel often found himself reflecting on the injustice that had befallen him, the absence of his father, and the relentless attention of the town. His thoughts returned constantly to the leather-bound journal and the cryptic message about Pembroke. Each observation, every whispered comment, every small act of cruelty became part of a larger pattern he had to decode. Nathaniel understood that survival demanded more than obedience. It required insight, patience, and a readiness to act when opportunity presented itself. In this environment, even silence could be a tool, and every moment of careful listening became a form of vigilance. The boy's endurance and emerging understanding did not go unnoticed. A few townspeople, perhaps quietly impressed by his persistence, began to offer subtle assistance. A warm meal left at the doorstep, a whispered warning about particularly harsh assignments, a discreet nod of encouragement. These gestures were small, almost imperceptible, but they strengthened Nathaniel's resolve. He recognized that even in a town dominated by fear and suspicion, human compassion had not entirely vanished. These fragments of kindness became crucial, offering glimpses of hope and reinforcing the idea that observation and careful alliances could provide the leverage necessary to withstand the town's relentless pressure. As Nathaniel continued to navigate the town's hostility, he realized that his own resilience was growing. The forced labor, public scrutiny, and deliberate acts of cruelty had sharpened his mind, strengthened his endurance, and refined his ability to anticipate challenges. He began formulating strategies, thinking several steps ahead, and considering how to gather information about Wallace Pembroke's death without attracting further hostility. Every act of observation, every subtle interaction with townspeople, and every careful alliance contributed to a growing sense of control over circumstances that initially seemed entirely oppressive. The town's pressure, though unyielding, was shaping Nathaniel in ways few could understand. He had learned to read expressions, anticipate intentions, and interpret silence as effectively as speech. He had developed patience, discretion, and resilience, realizing that every subtle move could determine the difference between survival and disaster. The relentless cruelty of Ashford Hollow was not only testing him, but teaching him, forging a boy who would need all his intelligence, courage, and insight to navigate the perilous environment created by fear, suspicion, and secret motives. Despite the hardship, Nathaniel's determination never faltered. He repeated silently to himself, reinforcing his vow to uncover the truth, protect his family, and survive the relentless judgment of Ashford Hollow. The story of his father, the death of Wallace Pembroke, and the town's cruel treatment of a boy too young to understand. Fully, the forces against him were intertwined. In a web he had begun to decipher, the challenges continued, the cruelty intensified, and the danger grew. But Nathaniel's quiet vigilance, careful alliances, and developing insight had begun to equip him for the trials ahead. Through this relentless adversity, Nathaniel's story had begun to take shape as more than a tale of suffering. It was a story of endurance, intelligence, and emerging courage. The boy who had been forced to pay for his father's crime had begun to understand that survival and truth were intertwined, that careful observation, patience, and strategy were as essential as physical strength, and that even in a town ruled by suspicion and cruelty, subtle alliances and small acts of kindness could tip the balance. The shadow of Ashford Hollow was long and unyielding, but Nathaniel Carter was learning to navigate it with a quiet determination that no amount of cruelty could extinguish. Nathaniel felt the town's scrutiny tighten around him like an invisible noose. Every step, every word, every gesture was observed, weighed, and judged. The merchants who once ignored him now delivered instructions with clipped tones, while neighbors whispered openly about the boy who bore the burden of a father's alleged crime. It was clear that the town's cruelty had escalated beyond labor and whispers. Now suspicion and malice were engineered to keep him isolated. Exhausted and fearful, every glance from Sheriff Hale or his deputies carried the authority of people, convinced of guilt without evidence. Nathaniel understood that endurance alone would no longer be sufficient. He needed subtlety, intelligence, and observation to survive. While repairing the fence along the Carter property, Nathaniel noticed a figure lingering near the edge of the road. It was a man he had not seen before, his coat long and dark, his posture rigid. The stranger's eyes lingered on Nathaniel in a way that made him uneasy, as though studying him for something beyond mere curiosity. Nathaniel paused, gripping the hammer in his hands, realizing that the town's hostility might now be accompanied by hidden observers with unknown motives. His father's warnings echoed in his mind. He had been left to navigate not only labor and ridicule, but also forces invisible to the ordinary eye. Survival demanded constant vigilance and awareness of threats that could appear without warning. Nathaniel's movements became more cautious. He took care to observe not just the obvious faces in the streets, but also the shadows, the patterns of the townspeople, and the subtle changes in their behavior. He realized that even small acts of kindness could conceal motives, and small gestures of cruelty could mask larger dangers. Every interaction became a test, every encounter a potential trap. The boy who had once relied on compliance and Endurance began to rely on perception and strategy, learning to measure intentions and anticipate consequences before speaking or acting. The leather-bound journal offered cryptic clues that Nathaniel examined with renewed urgency. Each entry seemed to point towards secrets that were deliberately hidden from the public eye. Wallace Pembroke's death, the accusations against Jonathan Carter, and the subtle manipulations within the town suggested a network of hidden agendas and dangerous individuals. Nathaniel pieced together fragments of observation, whispers from sympathetic townspeople, and notes from his father to begin constructing a picture of what might have truly occurred. The complexity of the situation made the boy's burden heavier, yet it also sparked a determination to uncover what had been buried behind lies and fear. Through careful observation, Nathaniel discovered that some townspeople were less openly hostile but still played a role in his suffering. Their eyes lingered too long during errands. Their whispers followed him even when no one else was near. And small acts of interference, misplaced tools, deliberately delayed instructions, subtle shifts in authority, reminded him that the web of cruelty extended beyond the obvious. Survival required not just strength and patience, but discretion, intelligence, and an acute understanding of human behavior. Nathaniel began cataloging these behaviors mentally, learning to predict movements, anticipate hostility, and identify subtle opportunities for information gathering. Among the few sources of support was Elias Monroe, whose cautious presence became vital. The older boy guided Nathaniel through interactions with the town, offering hints, warnings, and encouragement when it was safe. Together, they navigated the hidden threats, using observation and discretion to minimize risk. Nathaniel's awareness of danger grew sharper, his instincts more acute, and his ability to interpret subtle signals from the environment more precise. He realized that understanding the town's unspoken rules was as crucial as performing the tasks imposed upon him, and that knowledge could become a tool for both survival and eventual justice. The relentless cruelty, physical exhaustion, and social isolation had begun to forge in Nathaniel a quiet resilience. He moved with care, measured his words, and considered every action for its potential consequences. Even as the town sought to dominate him with intimidation, he discovered the capacity to endure, observe, and act with intention. The boy who had been forced to pay for his father's alleged crime learned to balance patience with vigilance, finding subtle ways to maintain agency in a world determined to strip it away. One moment of subtle defiance came when Nathaniel noticed discrepancies in the instructions he received from multiple townspeople. While completing errands, he began recording small inconsistencies, piecing together observations that might reveal patterns or hidden truths. The task was dangerous. If anyone discovered he was collecting information, the consequences could be severe. Yet he persisted, recognizing that uncovering the truth required courage, careful observation, and attention to detail. Each discovery brought him closer to understanding the network of manipulation surrounding his father's disappearance and Wallace Pembroke's death. As Nathaniel navigated the harsh environment, he became aware of moments of kindness that were deliberately quiet, almost imperceptible. A loaf of bread left at the doorstep, a glance from a neighbor, a small word of encouragement from Elias Monroe. These gestures reminded him that even in a town dominated by fear and cruelty, subtle compassion could exist. Each act strengthened his resolve, reinforcing the notion that patience, observation, and careful alliances were crucial for survival. Nathaniel began to recognize the delicate balance between secrecy, trust, and strategy in a town determined to maintain its own narrative. The pressure, isolation, and hidden threats created an atmosphere where every choice carried consequences. Nathaniel learned to weigh every word, every action, and every interaction, Observation became his most powerful tool, enabling him to anticipate dangers, interpret intentions, and identify potential allies. The cruel environment shaped his understanding of human behavior, revealing the layers of deception, fear, and self-interest that governed Ashford Hollow. Even as exhaustion threatened, he found clarity in the patterns around him, slowly constructing a plan that relied not solely on labor or endurance but on careful thought and awareness. Amid these challenges, Nathaniel reminded himself of his father's lessons and his own vow. Each step, each observation, each subtle act of defiance strengthened his determination to uncover the truth. The boy, forced to pay for his father's crime, began to recognize that endurance was insufficient. Intelligence, strategy, and courage were essential. The town had escalated its cruelty and scrutiny, but Nathaniel's growing awareness and careful alliances provided him with tools to navigate the perilous landscape. He realized that surviving Ashford Hollow meant understanding its secrets, anticipating its threats, and remaining vigilant even when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. As the story unfolded, Nathaniel's resilience and emerging strategy became central to the narrative. His awareness of the town's hidden threats, the subtle cruelty of its citizens, and the potential for rare acts of kindness created a delicate tension between danger and hope. The boy's journey, burdened by inherited guilt and surrounded by deception, was far from over. Every observation, every act of endurance, and every careful alliance contributed to the growing strength he would need to confront the mysteries surrounding his father and Wallace Pembroke. If you are following Nathaniel's struggle and the unfolding secrets of Ashford Hollow, comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Your support helps reveal the story to more viewers and ensures that the journey of the boy, forced to pay for his father's crime, continues with each chapter. Nathaniel's battle is far from over, and the coming challenges will test every ounce of courage, endurance, and insight he has developed. Nathaniel had endured relentless cruelty, exhaustion, and suspicion for as long as he could remember, yet he refused to bow beneath the weight imposed upon him. Each observation, every subtle act of kindness, and each careful calculation of human behavior had brought him closer to understanding the web of deception surrounding Wallace Pembroke's death and the town's relentless pursuit of punishment for a crime his father had never committed. The boy's resolve had hardened into a quiet strength, one tempered by suffering, careful thought, and the knowledge that patience would be as crucial as courage. Through the fragments in his father's journal and the careful observations of townspeople, Nathaniel began to identify patterns that had previously seemed random. He realized that the town's cruelty was not merely the result of fear or rumor. It had been deliberately orchestrated by a few influential figures who sought to conceal something far darker. The whispers, the laborious tasks, the constant observation all served to keep him distracted, exhausted and fearful, while the true narrative remained hidden. Understanding this, Nathaniel recognized the opportunity to act strategically, using his endurance and growing knowledge to confront the deception that had ensnared both him and his father. Guided by Elias Munro, Nathaniel began to gather concrete evidence, subtle at first, yet sufficient to piece together the truth. The boy watched the side movements of Sheriff Hale and several influential townspeople, noting conversations and connections previously unnoticed. He discovered hidden correspondences that linked certain figures to Wallace Pembroke's demise, revealing a chain of decisions designed to protect secrets rather than deliver justice. With each new piece of information, Nathaniel's sense of purpose strengthened. He knew that exposing the truth required both timing and precision, as the town's powerful individuals would resist any challenge to their authority. Nathaniel's first cautious confrontation came through carefully placed questions and deliberate observations. He noticed contradictions in statements made by those who had accused his father, and he followed subtle clues that led him to the hidden motives behind their actions. These revelations were dangerous. A single misstep could have brought renewed punishment, but the boy's vigilance and intelligence allowed him to navigate the treacherous environment. Slowly, he began to understand that the town's cruelty had been a means to control him, but the same cruelty had inadvertently sharpened his insight and resolve. The culmination of Nathaniel's observations led him to a private meeting with Elias Monroe, where they reviewed the evidence and formulated a plan to reveal the truth. It became clear that Wallace Pembroke's death had been manipulated by certain town figures to protect hidden interests, and Jonathan Carter had been unjustly accused. The plan required careful timing and a strategic presentation of evidence that could not be ignored or silenced. Nathaniel understood that courage alone would not suffice. He needed to act with both precision and integrity to ensure the town could no longer enforce punishment based on falsehoods. As the plan unfolded, Nathaniel presented his findings to a small assembly of townspeople willing to listen. He displayed the hidden correspondences, pointed out contradictions in the accounts of influential figures, and recounted his father's journal entries, which had been ignored for so long. The weight of truth was undeniable, and even those most committed to the narrative of guilt could not dismiss the evidence. The boy who had once been a victim of inherited suspicion had transformed into a bearer of clarity, exposing the deception and cruelty that had shaped his life. The revelation did not erase the hardship he had endured, but it restored the integrity of his father's name and illuminated the mechanisms of injustice that had operated within Ashford Hollow. While some townspeople resisted, many acknowledged the revelations with quiet acknowledgement, recognizing the cruelty and manipulation that had governed their actions. Nathaniel's courage and intelligence had forced a reckoning, one that would prevent future injustices born of rumor, fear, and deliberate malice. The boy who had been forced to pay for his father's crime had not only survived, but had exposed the hidden truths that had allowed injustice to flourish. Through careful observation, resilience, and strategic action, Nathaniel had reclaimed agency over a life that had been dominated by forces beyond his control. In the aftermath, Nathaniel reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The labor, the whispers, the deliberate cruelty, and the subtle acts of kindness had all shaped him into a young man, capable of discerning truth from deception. The town's attempts to isolate and punish him had forged resilience, intelligence, and courage. The journey was far from easy, yet it had revealed both the depths of human cruelty and the power of patience, strategy, and perseverance. Nathaniel had endured the unrelenting pressures of Ashford Hollow and emerged not only as a survivor but as a witness to the truth that had long been hidden. As viewers follow Nathaniel's journey, they see a story of endurance, intelligence, and courage, where cruelty and deception are met with observation, patience, and strategy. If you have been captivated by Nathaniel's struggle and the unfolding revelations, comment below and tell us where you are watching from. Your engagement helps ensure that stories like his, filled with injustice, perseverance, and eventual vindication, continue to reach those who seek to witness the triumph of resilience over cruelty. Nathaniel Carter's story, burdened by inherited guilt, was now transformed into a testament to endurance, insight, and courage. The boy who had been forced to pay for his father's alleged crime had navigated a landscape of malice, secrecy, and hardship, using observation, careful alliances, and intelligence to uncover the truth. In the end, justice was not simply a matter of punishment or accusation, but of clarity, revelation, and the courage to confront deception even when every element of the environment sought to suppress it. Nathaniel's journey revealed that resilience strategy, and quiet determination could illuminate truths that fear, cruelty, and